You passed places to stop. Why didn't you stop back there?
Because it was dark. I was trying to stop where it was safer.
I gave you lawful commands.
And I followed them. From the start, but you put a gun on me over a seatbelt stop before you knew anything.
This officer thought he was detaining just another driver for a routine seatbelt stop, but he had no idea he was escalating a traffic stop on a sitting police chief who knew policy, procedure, and constitutional limits better than the people pointing commands at him. The officer believed he had control of the encounter, and that belief pushed him into a decision that made the whole stop dangerous. He drew his firearm and treated the driver like a fleeing suspect. The moment the officers realized who was behind the wheel, the power dynamic shifted, and it shifted fast, because suddenly this was no longer a small stop that could be explained away with a few vague words. Where are you watching from today? What city and state or what country? Put it in the comments. And if you like stories where calm discipline and documentation beat intimidation, hit like and subscribe, because this one shows exactly how a simple stop can become a lawsuit when officers lose their judgment. Here's how it started. It was early morning in Jacksonville, Florida, at a time when the roads were mostly clear and the lighting was uneven depending on the block. Chief Darnell Hayes was driving to work in his own vehicle, and he was already mentally in work mode because he was on duty and heading in to start his day. He was not looking for attention, and he was not trying to make a point. He was simply driving the way thousands of people do every morning. Officer Mason Klein was working patrol and watching traffic. He decided to stop Hayes for what he believed was a seatbelt violation. That kind of stop is normally routine, and most officers handle it with a quick approach, a brief conversation, and a warning or citation. Nothing about a seatbelt stop requires a high-intensity response, unless something else happens to justify it. Klein activated his lights behind Hayes. Hayes noticed the patrol car and made a decision that many people make for safety, especially people who have spent years responding to roadside incidents. He did not stop immediately in the first dark or awkward spot he saw. He continued driving for a short distance so he could pull over in an area that felt safer, more visible, and less isolated. He did not accelerate away, and he did not weave or attempt to lose the patrol car. He simply kept moving long enough to reach a location where he believed the stop could happen without putting him in unnecessary danger. Klein did not treat that choice as a safety decision. Klein treated it as a refusal to comply, and that interpretation changed the entire stop. Instead of approaching as if this was a minor traffic issue, he approached as if he was dealing with a driver who was trying to evade police. He positioned his vehicle in a way that signaled escalation and urgency, and he exited his patrol car with a posture and pace that matched a felony-style stop, not a seatbelt warning. When Klein reached Hayes' vehicle, he drew his firearm. That action immediately raised the stakes for everyone involved, because the encounter was no longer a conversation. From that point on, Hayes had to manage the situation as if one misunderstanding could lead to someone making a catastrophic decision. Hayes kept his hands visible and did not make any sudden movements. He followed instructions carefully and spoke in a measured way because he understood that an officer who had already pulled a gun was operating on fear and assumptions, not on clear evidence. Hayes explained why he did not stop instantly and said he had continued driving briefly because he wanted to pull over in a place he considered safe. He also made it clear that he was on duty and heading to work. He was not arguing about authority, and he was not trying to debate on the roadside. He was trying to bring the encounter back to reality and reduce the danger. Klein did not accept that explanation as reasonable. Instead, he pressed Hayes as if Hayes had committed a more serious offense than a seatbelt violation. He asked questions that treated the short delay as suspicious behavior, and he framed the situation as if Hayes needed to justify himself rather than simply comply with a normal traffic stop. He ordered Hayes out of the vehicle and maintained a controlling tone, which signaled that Klein wanted dominance in the encounter and was not interested in a routine resolution. Backup officers arrived, including Officer Tessa Ramirez. Ramirez quickly understood that the scene was out of proportion to the original reason for the stop. She observed Hayes' behavior and could see that he was not acting aggressively, not acting erratically, and not presenting himself like someone who was about to attack anyone. She also observed Klein's posture and the drawn weapon, and she recognized that once that level of escalation happens, officers often start looking for reasons to justify it after the fact. That is exactly where the stop began to go next. Klein shifted from enforcement of a seatbelt allegation into investigative fishing. He questioned Hayes repeatedly about why he kept driving after the lights came on, and he layered on additional questions that were not necessary to resolve a seatbelt issue. He pushed the encounter toward a vehicle search by probing for anything that might allow him to claim suspicion of something else. He asked about what was inside the car and tried to move the interaction toward consent, because consent searches are an easy way for officers to expand a stop, even when they do not have probable cause. Hayes did not give consent. Hayes refused in a controlled and professional way, and he did it without raising his voice or giving Klein an emotional reaction. He understood what consent meant, and he understood how stops like this get reframed later in reports. He also understood that the moment he allowed a search, just to get it over with, he would be validating an escalation that never should have happened. Klein reacted poorly to that boundary. He continued trying to justify the detention by treating Hayes' short delay in pulling over as proof that Hayes was suspicious. He kept the tone accusatory and tried to maintain pressure, because pressure is how officers sometimes get people to make mistakes, become emotional, or start pleading. Hayes did not do any of that. He stayed composed, stayed clear, and kept the stop focused on what it was supposed to be about. As the encounter dragged on, Hayes identified himself again, clearly, with enough detail that the officers could verify it if they chose to do their jobs properly. He said who he was and made it obvious that he was not a random driver guessing at a title. At that point, the stop reached a moment where Klein had to decide whether he was going to keep escalating based on pride or whether he was going to verify the information and reset the encounter. Klein did not immediately reset. He acted skeptical, which mattered because it revealed how committed he was to the story he had already built in his head. Instead of backing down and treating the situation like a seatbelt stop, he continued holding Hayes in an elevated posture, while he sought verification through normal law enforcement channels. The process to confirm Hayes' identity began through communications and dispatch checks, because that is how officers confirm credentials and identities when they claim they are unsure. While that verification process was happening, the atmosphere shifted in a subtle but real way. Ramirez became more cautious in her tone and body language because she could sense that Klein might have made a serious mistake. Klein's posture also changed, because a drawn weapon and a high-intensity detention look very different when the person detained turns out to be a senior law enforcement official who understands the law and will not let the incident disappear quietly. By that point, Hayes was no longer just trying to get through a stressful stop safely. He was watching how officers behaved when they thought nobody important was looking, and the officers were about to learn that this stop was not going to be forgotten or buried, because the driver had the knowledge and the position to force accountability. The confirmation came back the way confirmations always come back, when someone tells the truth and the system finally checks. The name matched. The position matched. The officers on scene suddenly had a new problem, because the stop they had been running like a possible fleeing suspect situation now had a clear identity attached to it. Chief Darnell Hayes. You could tell the change wasn't philosophical. It was survival. The tone softened because it had to. The posture changed because it had to. This was no longer a random driver they could pressure, lecture, or casually search. This was a senior law enforcement official who understood every step they had taken and could explain in plain language why several of those steps didn't make legal sense. Officer Klein tried to recover control without admitting he lost it. He shifted his focus back toward the original justification, the alleged seatbelt violation, as if the last several minutes had been an overreaction that didn't count. He also tried to reframe the escalation as standard safety procedure. He kept returning to the same point. Hayes didn't stop immediately when the lights came on, and that made Klein believe something was wrong. Hayes didn't let that excuse stand unchallenged, but he also didn't turn it into a shouting contest. He explained the decision the way an experienced supervisor explains a decision. He continued driving briefly because he wanted a safe location, and he stopped as soon as he reached one. He made it clear he was not attempting to evade, and he made it clear that his behavior during the stop had been calm and compliant from the start. That put Klein in a corner because the facts didn't support the story Klein wanted. If Klein insisted Hayes was fleeing, he would have to explain why the vehicle did not speed away, why Hayes stopped in a well-lit area, and why Hayes immediately complied once the stop began. If Klein insisted the drawn firearm and the high-intensity commands were appropriate, he would have to explain what specific threat indicators existed beyond the short distance Hayes drove before stopping. That is the kind of explanation that sounds weak on body camera and even worse in a report, because it turns into broad statements like, "I feared for my safety," with nothing concrete under it. So Klein went to the next move officers use when they need to justify time and intensity. He tried to find something else. He started pressing again toward the vehicle. The questions weren't framed as questions anymore. They were framed as an attempt to create a reason. He tried to angle toward a search, or at least toward a look inside, because the easiest way to make an over-escalated stop seem worth it is to claim you found something. Hayes refused again, clearly and professionally. He did not argue about whether Klein could search. He simply did not give permission. He kept the stop inside its legal limits. He held that line calmly, which made the contrast obvious. One side was trying to expand the stop without a solid basis, and the other side was refusing to be bullied into waiving rights. That refusal forced another shift. Officer Ramirez and the other responding officers started acting like they wanted the stop to end. They weren't laughing. They weren't relaxed. They were watching Klein choose between doubling down or cutting losses. This is where pride usually decides what happens next. Pride keeps stops going. Pride creates arrests that don't hold up. Pride turns a citation into handcuffs. Klein tried to keep a firm face, but the momentum was gone. The accusations got smaller. The language got less intense. The earlier fleeing suspect posture didn't match the reality in front of them anymore, especially now that Hayes' identity had been confirmed. At this point, Klein could not credibly claim he was dealing with an unknown threat because the driver had been identified and had been composed the entire time. A field supervisor arrived, Sergeant Paul Denton. Denton didn't roll up confused about what to do. He rolled up doing damage control. The first thing he did was orient himself to the facts, why the stop started, why the stop escalated, and what the officers had in writing and on camera. Then he focused on the outcome, because supervisors think in outcomes. A supervisor knows what a messy stop turns into later. Complaints, internal reviews, lawyers, headlines. Denton addressed Hayes with a more controlled tone. He treated him like a professional, which was a noticeable change compared to how the stop began. Denton also steered the conversation away from dramatic claims and back toward the only thing that still made sense on paper, the seatbelt allegation. Klein still tried to defend his earlier decision-making, but now he was doing it in front of a supervisor and a police chief. That's not the same as defending it in front of a civilian. The words have to line up with policy. The logic has to line up with law. The timeline has to line up with Bodycam. Hayes listened. Hayes stayed calm. Hayes did not let them rewrite the sequence. He pointed out in a controlled way what the stop had become. A minor traffic allegation had turned into a high-intensity detention with a drawn weapon and an attempt to expand the stop into a search. He also made it clear that he only drove a short distance to a safer location and that he had communicated that from the beginning. Denton understood the core issue right away. Even if Klein claimed he had concerns, the stop still had to be reasonable in scope and duration. Even if Klein claimed he misunderstood the short delay, the response still had to fit the facts. A seatbelt allegation does not naturally lead to guns and prolonged detention unless the driver gives real indicators of danger. Hayes had not. So Denton guided the stop toward the exit. They dropped the bigger framing. They stopped pressing the evasion angle. The search attempt went nowhere because Hayes did not consent and they did not have a real legal foundation to force it. They fell back to a citation because that was the only thing that still matched the original reason for contact. Klein issued the minor citation. The mood on scene was not victory, it was discomfort. It looked like people realizing they had escalated the wrong person in the wrong way for the wrong reason, and now there was no clean way to pretend it never happened. Hayes took the citation and ended the encounter without theatrics. He did not threaten anyone on scene. He did not try to embarrass them in the moment. He did something more effective. He made it clear, through his composure and his precision, that he understood exactly where the stop went wrong, and that the next steps would happen through oversight channels, not roadside arguments. He left and continued to work. And the officers stayed behind with the footage, the radio logs, and the realization that this stop had already become a record. After Hayes got to work, he didn't treat the stop like an awkward story to laugh off. He treated it like a serious incident that could have gone badly for any regular person, and the only reason it didn't go worse was because he stayed controlled and understood exactly how to keep the stop inside legal lines. He also understood something else. If he didn't document it properly, the narrative would get written without him. So he started doing what experienced law enforcement leaders do when they need the truth preserved. He created a clean timeline while the details were fresh. He noted the reason given for the stop, how far he drove before pulling over, what location he chose and why, when the firearm came out, and how the officers tried to shift the stop into a search situation. He didn't write it like a rant. He wrote it like a report. Then he went through the channels that matter. He requested the body camera footage. He requested the dash camera footage if it existed. He requested the CAD logs and radio traffic that showed how the stop was classified in real time, because that detail matters. A seatbelt stop logged as a routine traffic stop is one thing. A seatbelt stop that gets treated like an attempt to flee situation is another. The labels officers choose in the moment often tell you what was driving their decisions. Inside the department, word moved fast. Not because Hayes wanted drama, but because cops talk. Someone heard the name. Someone heard, "We stopped a chief." Someone heard, "Gun came out." People started connecting it to the usual pattern they had seen before. A small reason for contact, followed by a big reaction, followed by a quick attempt to make the paperwork match the reaction. Some people defended Klein immediately, because that's what happens when officers circle up. They leaned on the usual phrases. Officer safety, unknown risk. Driver didn't stop immediately. Anything could happen on a traffic stop. Those phrases are common because they're flexible. They can be used to explain almost any escalation after the fact. Other people didn't defend it because the facts were too ugly. They knew the difference between a driver actually trying to run and a driver rolling to a safe location. They knew what true threat indicators look like. They knew that pulling a gun on a compliant driver over a seatbelt allegation creates risk, not safety. They also knew that when the person detained is calm and experienced, the footage usually tells a story without needing a speech. Then the stop started leaking beyond the building. It didn't require a big media campaign. It didn't require a press conference. In situations like this, one clip or one description gets shared with a friend, then another, then it hits the group chats. And once the story is out, it spreads because people recognize the pattern, even if they don't recognize the names. The community reaction wasn't complicated. People weren't debating the seatbelt allegation. They were reacting to the escalation. They were reacting to the gun. They were reacting to the way a minor stop turned into a detention that felt like punishment. And a lot of people said the quiet part out loud. If it happened to a chief, it can happen to anyone. If the chief had been a regular civilian, the stop might have ended very differently. Hayes watched that reaction, but he didn't build his response around public outrage. He built it around proof. He focused on what could be verified. The original alleged violation, the time and distance between lights and pullover, the officer's commands, whether there were any real indicators of danger, and the attempt to search his vehicle without a solid basis. He kept coming back to reasonableness, because that's the standard that matters later when lawyers and reviewers get involved. The internal side moved the way internal systems usually move. There were discussions about policy and training. There were conversations about whether the stop met departmental standards. There were quiet check-ins about how to describe the event without making the department look reckless. There were also conversations that looked like protection, because departments often tried to manage a problem instead of admitting it. Hayes didn't let the story become a misunderstanding. He acknowledged the basic reality that officers sometimes make fast decisions. He did not accept that fast decisions automatically become justified decisions. He knew the difference between a reasonable caution and an unreasonable escalation, and he knew the legal risk created when officers treat a driver like a suspect without evidence. Weeks passed, and the situation didn't disappear. The footage existed. The logs existed. The citation existed. The sequence existed. Even if people tried to smooth it over, those records don't care about smoothing. They show what happened. And during that time, Hayes also saw something that likely hardened his position: the way the officers and the system tried to minimize it. Not always with lies, but with soft language, with framing, with excuses that avoided the core question, which was simple. What justified drawing a firearm and detaining a compliant driver over a seatbelt allegation and a short, safety-based delay in pulling over? That question didn't go away, because it didn't have a good answer. By the time months had passed, Hayes wasn't looking at the stop as an isolated moment anymore. He was looking at it as unconstitutional overreach, and he was looking at it through the lens of race and pattern, because he understood what many black drivers have experienced for years. Minor reasons turning into major escalations when assumptions take over. That's when the legal path became unavoidable. Hayes filed a lawsuit seeking $200,000, arguing the stop involved racial profiling and unconstitutional policing, and that the escalation went far beyond what was reasonable for the alleged seatbelt violation. The lawsuit didn't exist because he was angry about a ticket. It existed because the stop showed how quickly an officer could manufacture a dangerous situation out of nothing. And once the lawsuit was filed, the story entered a new phase. Now it wasn't just community talk. Now it was attorneys, records requests, depositions, and policy reviews. Now the officers' decisions would get measured against law, not just against their own explanations. Once Hayes filed the $200,000 lawsuit, the stop stopped being a bad moment and became a legal problem with a paper trail. That matters because courts don't care how confident an officer sounded on scene. They care what facts existed to justify the escalation. The lawsuit focused on a simple chain of decisions. It started with a minor allegation about a seatbelt. Then, the stop escalated into a high-intensity detention. A firearm came out. The officers treated Hayes like a fleeing suspect because he drove a short distance to pull over in a place he considered safe. Then they tried to stretch the stop further by pushing toward a vehicle search, even though they still didn't have real evidence that he was dangerous or involved in a crime. Hayes's legal argument was basically this. The officers turned a routine traffic contact into a constitutional violation, and they did it without a reasonable basis. He also argued it fit racial profiling because the assumptions and the intensity didn't match the behavior on camera, and the escalation happened before officers knew who he was. In other words, they treated him one way when he was just a black driver in the dark, and they treated him another way once they realized he had a title and authority. From the department side, the response followed the usual playbook. They leaned on officer safety. They leaned on, he didn't stop immediately. They leaned on the idea that traffic stops are unpredictable. That language shows up in a lot of cases because it can sound reasonable if you don't look closely. The problem is that unpredictable isn't a legal substitute for specific facts. A short delay to reach a well-lit area is not automatically evasion. An escalation has to be tied to what the officer can actually articulate, not what the officer guessed. Now, the officers had to defend their timeline. They had to explain why the stop went tactical over a seatbelt allegation. They had to explain why a gun was necessary. They had to explain why Hayes was handled as if he was a threat, even though his behavior stayed controlled and compliant. They had to explain why they tried to move toward a search when the original reason for the stop was minor. In a lawsuit, those questions don't get answered with vibes. They get answered with body cam footage, radio logs, and written reports that can be compared line by line. That comparison is what makes these cases dangerous for departments. If the report reads like a serious criminal stop, but the video shows a calm driver trying to pull over safely, the report becomes a liability. If the officer's justification sounds vague on camera, that vagueness follows them into depositions. If supervisors arrived and immediately tried to shrink the story back down to just a citation, that also becomes part of the record, because it shows the department recognized the escalation wasn't defensible. The lawsuit also created pressure inside the city structure. City attorneys get involved because money is on the line. Risk managers get involved because repeated incidents become patterns. Leadership gets involved because the public doesn't separate one officer from the system when something like this happens. Even if a case settles quietly, it still forces review because the department doesn't want the same kind of stop happening again and turning into another payout. Behind closed doors, the conversation usually turns practical and blunt. They look at policy, they look at training, they look at how officers interpret a driver continuing to a safe location. They look at when a weapon is drawn and what the minimum facts are supposed to be. They look at consent searches because departments know the public hates when a minor stop turns into phishing. They also look at supervision because supervisors exist to stop small problems from becoming big ones. And this stop became big. For Hayes, the stop changed something personal too. He already understood these dynamics, but now he had lived it from the other side while carrying the title that should have insulated him. That's the part that hit people hardest. If a chief could be treated like that while calm and compliant, then the average person with no badge, no status, and no experience had even less protection in the moment. That reality became the lasting message of the story. This wasn't about a seatbelt. It was about how fast an officer can turn uncertainty into aggression, then try to justify it afterward. It was about how composure can keep you alive, but composure shouldn't be the price of basic rights. It was about the difference between lawful policing and control for the sake of control. And it was also about something uncomfortable. Respect changed once the officers knew who Hayes was. The same driver, same hands, same calm tone. The difference was the title. That contrast is what makes people call it profiling, because it suggests the first version of Hayes they responded to wasn't citizen, it was threat. So here's the question for you. If you were driving and you didn't feel safe pulling over immediately, would you keep going to a well-lit area, or would you stop the second you saw lights, even if the location felt risky? And if you've ever had a stop escalate over something small, What was the moment you realized it wasn't about the original reason anymore? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more realistic story times where accountability actually lands, make sure you subscribe.
Step outside right now. Let's go.
Who are you and why are you in my house?
None of your business. Step
You're
outside.
in my home with guns up. Show me a warrant.
Marcus, you're making this worse for
Worse than
yourself.
waking my kid up with guns in the hallway? Show the warrant or get
Deep
out of my
breath over
house.
body.
The officers were already inside the hallway when Malik Carter fully woke up. Flashlights hit the walls. A weapon light swept across family photos. 2 pistols were up at chest level, like they expected a fight. Malik stood there in his boxers with his hands visible, trying to angle his body so his child stayed behind him and out of the line of sight. The lead officer kept barking for Malik to step outside immediately, like the house belonged to the department, for the next 5 minutes. Malik didn't move fast. He moved careful. He kept his voice steady. He asked who they were and why they were in his home. That question irritated them. You could hear it in their tone. They wanted obedience, not a conversation. Before we go further, drop where you're watching from, country or state. And if you watch these stories for the real-world chess match, recording, accountability, people refusing to be bullied, hit like and subscribe. A lot of folks never see how fast a mistake turns into intimidation until it's on camera. Now, here's how it started, because the sequence matters. Malik and Tiana Carter had a routine every night. Doors checked, locks turned, alarm set, cameras running. Not a big dramatic security setup, just basic protection. They had a kid in the house, and they lived in a place where people loved to say it was safe. But Malik didn't confuse quiet with immune. That night was normal. They went to bed, no visitors, no late calls, no chaos. Then, sometime before dawn, the house got hit with movement and noise. Not a polite knock, not a doorbell. More like a sudden presence at the entry that didn't belong there. The next moment, Malik was awake to armed strangers inside. The first thing he focused on was his child. The kid had gotten up, confused and scared, pulled by the noise. Malik stepped into the hallway fast enough to block the kid from walking forward, but not so fast that an officer could claim he charged. Tiana came out seconds later, half asleep, and instantly alert. She saw guns. She saw her partner undressed and cornered in his own hallway. She saw her child behind him. Her brain clicked into one mode: keep everyone alive and document everything. Malik kept trying to slow the situation down. He asked again what they were doing there. The lead officer, Brandt, refused to give a clean explanation. He treated Malik like a problem to manage. He kept repeating the command to go outside, as if stepping onto the porch would magically make the entry legal. That's when the officers introduced their reason. They were looking for someone. A fugitive. A name Malik had never heard in his life. Malik told them he didn't know the person. No hesitation. No maybe. He didn't add extra details that could be twisted, just a direct answer. The normal outcome right there should have been simple. Wrong house. Back out. Apology. Leave the family to calm down. That's not what happened. Instead of ending it, the officers leaned in harder. They kept asking the same thing in different ways, like persistence would produce a different truth. They started scanning the house like they were shopping for a justification. They demanded Malik's ID while standing inside his home, even though he hadn't invited them in, and they still hadn't said anything clear about lawful authority. Malik didn't refuse because he wanted a standoff. He refused because the order made no sense in context. They were already in the wrong place. They were already pointing guns near a family, and now they wanted Malik to help them paper over it with compliance. He asked for a warrant. This is where the officer's story started changing, right on camera. At first, they suggested the entry wasn't really an entry because the door was open or unlocked. That's a convenient explanation because it frames the homeowner as careless and the officers as reactive, not invasive. Malik and Tiana immediately disputed it. They said the doors had been locked. That wasn't an argument about feelings. It was their nightly routine. Then, as Malik kept asking for a warrant, a different explanation started floating around. Now the officers claimed they had been knocking for a long time. That version was meant to make it sound like the family ignored them, like they had no choice but to come in. Those two stories didn't fit together. If the door was open, why the long knocking story? If they'd been knocking forever, why was Malik waking up to them already inside with guns up? The contradictions mattered because they weren't small details. They were the difference between a lawful contact and a serious violation. Brandt tried to end the questions by implying they had legal cover. He hinted at a warrant without producing one. He said it in that confident way some officers do, like the word itself should stop the conversation. Malik didn't let it. Malik kept his hands visible. He kept his voice controlled. He kept repeating the same demand. Show the warrant or explain the emergency that allowed them in without one. No paper appeared, no case number, no judge's name, no dispatch detail that made it sound urgent. Just pressure and impatience. Tiana stayed near enough to keep her child close, but she also positioned her phone so it captured the officers' faces and voices. She wasn't waving it around. She wasn't doing theatrics. She was collecting what they were giving her, shifting explanations and hostile posture. And then came the part that told you exactly what kind of encounter this was going to be. Even with a child in the hallway and cameras visible, the officers acted annoyed that Malik cared they'd brought guns into a sleeping family's home. They minimized it. They treated his concern like an inconvenience. That's not a, "we made a mistake." That's a, "how dare you challenge us?" Malik didn't take the bait. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He did the one thing that tends to make bad behavior unravel. He kept demanding specifics, names, reason, authority, warrant. The officers realized they weren't getting easy compliance. They also realized the footage was building a timeline they couldn't control. So they started looking for leverage, something unrelated they could use to flip the dynamic, something that would make Malik stop focusing on the entry and start worrying about consequences. That pivot began when one of them noticed something in the kitchen area and decided to change the topic. One of the officers shifted his stance and let his flashlight drift past Malik's shoulder down the hall toward the kitchen. That's when the mission changed. Not officially, not out loud. You could just see it in how they started talking. They'd come in claiming they were looking for a fugitive. Malik already told them he didn't know the name. That should have ended the contact. Instead, the officers started acting like he'd spotted a new problem that could justify everything they'd already done. Malik kept repeating the same core point. They were inside his home. They hadn't shown a warrant, and they hadn't explained any emergency. He wanted a supervisor. He wanted documentation. He wanted them out. Brandt didn't answer cleanly. He kept steering back to control. He kept pushing Malik to step outside. It wasn't about safety anymore. It was about getting Malik off his own property line. So the story became, "we talked outside," instead of, "we entered your home." Tiana clocked it too. She didn't argue just to argue. She focused on capturing the parts that couldn't be walked back later. The lack of identification, the lack of warrant, the shifting reasons for entry. She also kept her child close and out of the hallway traffic because these officers were moving like the house was theirs to pace through. Then Brandt tried a different pressure point. He claimed there was marijuana visible in the kitchen. And right away you could tell what that was. A pivot. A bargaining chip. Something to make Malik stop asking about the door and start defending himself. Malik didn't take the bait. He didn't start explaining what was or wasn't in his kitchen. He didn't start confessing to anything. He brought it back to the entry. He wanted the warrant. He wanted the legal basis. He wanted to know why they were pointing weapons inside a family home over a person Malik didn't know. Brandt didn't like that Malik wasn't scared of side quests. So he escalated the tone. He demanded identification again, this time with more edge, like refusing was a crime by itself. Malik didn't need to shout to make the point. He made it plain. Officers don't get to walk into a house without a warrant and then demand papers like the homeowner is crossing a border. At that moment, the officers started stacking contradictions faster. One officer kept leaning on the door was open idea. Another kept implying they'd been knocking forever. Brandt hovered between both stories, depending on what sounded more convincing in the moment. None of them matched the reality that the Carters were asleep and woke up to guns already inside. That mismatch mattered, because Malik was recording the timeline with his words, while Tiana recorded the scene with her camera. Every time the officers changed the explanation, it made the earlier statement look like a lie. Brandt tried to force the conversation into a different lane again. He acted like Malik's questions were the real problem. He treated Malik's calm demand for a warrant like disrespect. He talked down to him. The energy was clear. Comply first, ask questions later. Malik refused that order. He kept his voice even, but he didn't soften the boundary. He told them again that they were being recorded and this would have consequences. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a fact. That's when the officers' attitude got nastier. They started mocking the situation. Not openly laughing like it was a joke, but that dismissive tone that says, they don't think your rights count when they're inconvenienced. They minimized the guns. They minimized the panic they caused. They acted like Malik should be grateful they hadn't done worse. Tiana's patience snapped internally, but she stayed controlled. She kept her phone steady. She kept her child behind her now, creating space between the kid and the officers. She understood something Malik understood too. If they could intimidate the parents into emotional reactions, they could later describe that emotion as aggression. So Malik stayed boring, calm, precise, repeating the same demands. He asked for the warrant again. Brandt implied it existed again. Still nothing. No paper, no specific warrant detail, no clear statement of lawful entry. Just a constant push to get Malik outside and a new attempt to use the kitchen claim as leverage. And then Brandt made the pressure tactic uglier. He brought up Child Protective Services. Not because the child was harmed, not because they saw abuse, not because there was an emergency involving the kid. It came right after Malik wouldn't cooperate and right after the marijuana claim got ignored. It landed like a warning meant to scare parents into silence. That was the moment the encounter crossed from reckless to cruel. Because once an officer mentions CPS in a situation like this, the message is simple. Cooperate or we'll bring the system to your door again, in a different form. Tiana didn't crumble. She tightened up. She kept recording. Malik didn't lose control either. He did what disciplined people do when someone tries intimidation. He returned to facts. He demanded the warrant again. He demanded a supervisor. He demanded they explain how they entered on camera with a straight story that didn't change every 2 minutes. And you could see the officers realizing something uncomfortable. They weren't dealing with someone they could fluster into giving them an excuse. They were dealing with someone who understood that the only thing protecting the officers right now was confusion. And Malik wasn't confused. The moment the officers brought up Child Protective Services, Malik understood what they were doing. They weren't investigating an emergency involving his child. They weren't responding to a welfare call. They were using a family system that scares parents as a tool to get compliance after a shaky entry. That's why it landed when it did, right after Malik kept demanding proof of a warrant, and right after he refused to answer questions that didn't make sense. Malik stayed controlled, but his focus narrowed. He stopped entertaining side conversations and forced everything back to the one issue that mattered. The officers were inside his home, in the middle of the night, with guns out earlier, and they still hadn't shown any legal authority to be there. Brandt tried to keep momentum by repeating the same command to step outside. He framed it like a routine step, like Malik was being unreasonable for not doing it. Malik didn't move. He understood what stepping outside would do for them. If they got him onto the porch, the narrative becomes, "We made contact outside," and the entry becomes easier to blur. Malik wasn't giving them that reset. Tiana stood near the hallway opening, close enough to keep their child behind her and close enough to capture the officers clearly on her phone. She wasn't trying to perform. She was doing what a lot of people regret not doing later, documenting exactly who said what and when they said it. Malik asked for badge numbers and names. He asked for a supervisor. Then he asked for the warrant again. Brandt answered with the same vague confidence. He kept speaking like the warrant existed, like it was already settled, like Malik should accept it without seeing it. Malik didn't accept it. He asked for something specific. The warrant itself, the reason for it, and the details that would make it verifiable. Brandt didn't produce a document. He didn't give a warrant number. He didn't identify a judge. He didn't provide a case reference. He didn't pull up anything official that could be checked. He just kept talking around it. The longer he avoided specifics, the more the situation looked like exactly what Malik feared, an unlawful entry being patched up with authority language. Then, the officers started stepping on each other's stories in real time. One of them kept leaning on the claim that the door was open or unsecured, which made the entry sound accidental and convenient. Another leaned on the claim that they had been knocking for a long time, which made it sound like the family ignored police and forced their hand. Malik pointed out that those can't both be the clean explanation. If the door was open and that's why they entered, the long knocking story becomes irrelevant. If they were knocking for a long time, it doesn't match the family waking up to officers already inside with weapons and flashlights. The officers didn't resolve the contradiction. They tried to push past it. Brandt switched to a different tactic. He made Malik's refusal to comply the issue instead of their entry. He demanded Malik's identification again. He treated it like an order Malik had to follow, simply because police said it. Malik refused again, and he explained why in plain terms. He told them they were not going to flip this into him proving who he was, while they refused to prove why they were there. That's when the tone turned personal. Brandt started talking to Malik like Malik was the problem for insisting on his rights, like Malik was making it hard, like Malik should stop asking questions and just cooperate. The other officer backed him up with that same energy, pressure through irritation. They weren't calm professionals trying to correct a mistake. They were acting like Malik owed them a solution. Tiana stepped in and demanded the same information Malik demanded. Who are you? Why are you here? What gives you the right to be inside our home? Where's the warrant you keep mentioning? She didn't have to shout to make it sharp. The officers reacted like her asking those questions was disrespectful. That reaction was revealing, because questions aren't threats. Questions are what people ask when the other side won't explain themselves. Then came the part that made the footage feel especially disturbing. One of the officers minimized the danger of what they had done, bringing guns into a sleeping family's home and forcing a father to stand half-dressed while trying to keep his child safe. The attitude wasn't regretful, it was dismissive, like Malik should stop complaining and accept it as normal. That's the mask-off moment, because it shows they didn't see a family being terrified as a serious problem. They saw it as collateral. After that, Brandt circled back to the kitchen claim. Marijuana. Consequences. He tried to use it as a lever, as if introducing a new threat could make Malik stop talking about the entry. Malik refused to change topics. He didn't argue about what the officer claimed to see. He didn't explain. He didn't negotiate. He kept the same demand: show a warrant or leave. At this point, the officers were boxed in by reality. They were looking for a fugitive Malik didn't know. They couldn't get Malik to confirm anything helpful because Malik wasn't guessing or talking loosely. They couldn't produce a warrant to justify being inside. They couldn't control the narrative because the family was recording and the officers had already contradicted themselves. Their body language started shifting. They stopped pressing inward. They began drifting toward the exit while still trying to keep verbal dominance. They continued issuing commands, even as they backed away, trying to leave the impression that they were ending the encounter on their terms. Malik didn't follow them outside. He stayed in the doorway area, still keeping himself between the officers and his child. He made sure the record was clear while they were still in earshot. They entered without consent. They never showed a warrant. They gave conflicting explanations, and they escalated with unrelated threats, including Child Protective Services. The officers left without presenting any valid warrant. No paper, no clear documentation, no accountability in the moment. Just a retreat and an attitude that suggested they expected the family to stay quiet because the alternative was trouble. And the Carters stood there in the aftermath with one harsh truth. The only reason nobody got hurt was because Malik stayed disciplined, while armed strangers tried to bully their way out of a mistake. After the officers left, Malik and Tiana didn't calm down. They went into problem-solving mode. They checked on their child first. The kid was shaken and kept asking if the police would come back. Malik kept it simple and reassuring. Then he and Tiana started preserving evidence before anything could be lost. Tiana saved every file immediately: the interior camera footage, exterior footage, and her phone recording. She backed it up. Malik wrote down a clean timeline while it was fresh. When they woke up, where officers were standing, when guns were visible, what the officers said about the door, when the warrant claim appeared, and when the conversation shifted to marijuana and Child Protective Services. The next morning, Malik contacted the police department and asked for the incident number and the legal basis for the entry. He also asked directly about the warrant the officers claimed they had. The response he got wasn't a clear confirmation of any warrant. It was vague and evasive, which matched what happened in the house. That same day, the Carters contacted a civil rights attorney, Avery Ross. Ross didn't focus on anger. She focused on proof. She asked for the raw footage, not edited clips, and she told them not to debate the department or post anything impulsively. She wanted the story locked down with timestamps and documents. Ross then built the case around the simplest issue: authority and consistency. The officers were inside a private home during the night. The family said there was no consent. The officers implied a warrant but didn't show one. Their explanations for entry changed on camera. When Malik demanded legal justification, they introduced unrelated leverage: marijuana, then Child Protective Services. Ross filed records requests for dispatch logs, call notes, body camera footage, reports, and any warrant tied to that address. The goal was to compare what the officers said on video versus what they wrote afterward. The Carters also spoke to neighbors. One neighbor confirmed hearing sudden commotion and police activity, but did not recall a long period of knocking or announcements. That mattered because it challenged the "we knocked forever" explanation. When the department finally gave a formal response, it leaned on general language about looking for a fugitive and implied they acted appropriately. Ross responded with specifics: what emergency justified entry, what facts connected the suspect to that house at that time, and why officers repeatedly referenced a warrant they couldn't produce. Once the footage began spreading, the department's tone changed. They moved from denial to damage control. They wanted meetings. They wanted to resolve it. The case ended the way these usually end when the video is bad and the paperwork is weak. The city negotiated. The Carters reached a settlement. The department did not frame it like an admission, but the payout and internal review spoke for themselves. There were also policy changes tied to the incident: tighter verification before home entry during fugitive searches, stronger supervisor involvement, and clearer identification and documentation requirements. The city wanted fewer lawsuits like this, and this one was too clear on video to ignore. For Malik and Tiana, the win wasn't going viral. It was forcing the system to deal with what happened instead of burying it. They upgraded security, kept copies of everything, and learned the hard lesson a lot of families learn. When authority shows up wrong, documentation is protection. So here's the question. If officers entered your home and then couldn't produce a warrant while their story kept changing, would you stay quiet? Or would you do what Malik did and keep forcing them to justify every step? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who thinks it can't happen to regular people. And subscribe for more stories where accountability actually lands.
I said step down. Don't make this a thing.
No, tell me why you're here first.
You don't get to dictate how this goes. Step off the porch.
You can't just show up at my home and start giving orders with no
Stop
reason.
resisting.
I'm not resisting.
I'm standing on my porch.
Terrence Holloway thought he was doing the most normal thing in the world, standing on his girlfriend's porch in Dayton at 3 a.m., finishing a cigarette, until 4 police officers rolled up and immediately started talking to him like he was trespassing. They ordered him to step off the porch. Terrence didn't yell or posture. He stayed planted and asked what law he had broken. He explained that he lived there and treated the porch like what it was, part of a home, not a street corner. He also made it clear he wasn't going to answer questions or move positions just because officers wanted control of the situation. That's the detail people miss when they reduce it to, he didn't comply. Terrence wasn't refusing a lawful command in the middle of a crime scene. He was refusing to let a vague demand become the new law. The officers didn't respond with a specific violation. They kept repeating the order to come down. They pushed for identification. Terrence refused to identify himself and kept pressing for an actual legal reason behind the contact. He asked for a supervisor early because he recognized where this kind of encounter usually goes when officers feel challenged. A doorbell camera recorded the whole thing from a wide angle. It captured the officer's approach, the short back and forth, and the moment the tone shifted from pressure to physical action. Instead of walking away or slowing down for supervision, the officers closed distance. Within moments, they rushed Terrence, forced him to the ground, and put him in handcuffs. Even as they restrained him, he continued demanding an explanation for why they were confronting him in the first place. He kept repeating that they had no valid reason to approach him like this while he was at home. In the immediate aftermath, police framed the situation as justified. Their public position leaned on a familiar narrative. They described the neighborhood as a high-drug crime area and claimed Terrence was loitering. They also pointed to his refusal to identify himself as part of what they considered obstruction. Terrence rejected the entire framing. He said he wasn't loitering because he lived there. He said the officers created the conflict by trying to treat his porch like public space. He also argued that their approach wasn't about safety. It was about authority and ego. From his perspective, they used force because they couldn't produce a real legal basis for the stop. Then the story got more complicated. After the arrest, officers found an outstanding warrant connected to an earlier drug possession case. That discovery became a key issue because it raised an obvious question. Did the officers know about that warrant before they initiated contact, or did they stumble into it afterward? If they already knew, the entire encounter should have started with that reason. If they didn't know, the warrant looked like something found later to justify a stop that began without a solid foundation. The department also claimed the viral clip showed only a small portion of a longer encounter. They said officers were acting on reasonable suspicion based on information from a source alleging a man matching Terrence's description was involved in drug activity and might be armed. Officers also said they noticed suspicious circumstances involving a nearby vehicle and Terrence's behavior on the porch. Terrence's response stayed consistent. He said he was outside at home doing nothing illegal. He said the officers exceeded their authority. He said they abused their power. He wanted them fired. By the time the video spread, the case stopped being just a street-level arrest and turned into a credibility test. People weren't debating whether Terrence was polite enough. They were debating whether police could manufacture a detention on private property, call it reasonable suspicion, and then use force when the person refused to play along. Once Terrence got booked, The situation shifted from a physical confrontation to a paperwork battle. That's where these cases usually get decided, not on the porch. In reports, charging decisions, and how a department explains itself once video exists. Officers charged him with resisting arrest and obstruction. Those charges mattered because they're flexible. They don't require police to prove an original crime happened. They often depend on one idea. The person didn't cooperate with what officers claimed they were allowed to do. That framing only works if the officers can clearly explain what they were doing in the first place. The department's public defense leaned hard on context. They called the neighborhood a high-drug crime area. They described Terrence as loitering. They said the viral clip was only a portion of a longer encounter. Then they added a justification that shows up a lot after public backlash. A source had allegedly provided information about a man matching Terrence's description being involved in drug activity and possibly being armed. They also claimed there were suspicious circumstances involving a nearby vehicle and Terrence's behavior on the porch. That's the official story in its cleanest form: area, tip, suspicion, refusal to identify, escalation. Terrence kept his response simple. He said he was at home. He said standing on a porch at a residence wasn't loitering. He said the officers came in looking for submission, not answers. He also said the force happened because they couldn't name a law he broke and didn't like being challenged. From his perspective, they exceeded their authority and abused power, and he wanted them fired. The video made that argument easier for him because it captured the start, not the middle, not the aftermath, the opening moments. If a department claims an encounter was longer and more complex, the first question becomes, why didn't the reason show up early and clearly before the takedown? Then the warrant details surfaced. After the arrest, police discovered an outstanding warrant tied to an earlier drug possession case. That discovery didn't automatically validate the porch contact. It created a timeline problem. A warrant can justify an arrest when officers know about it and act on it. It doesn't magically justify force used before the warrant was even part of the encounter. If the warrant was found only after Terrence was in custody, it couldn't explain why 4 officers ordered him off a porch in the first place. If officers knew beforehand, the sequence should reflect that from the start. That's why the question about what they knew and when they knew it became central. The case stopped being about whether Terrence should have answered questions and became about whether police initiated the contact without a lawful basis and then built the justification afterward. Terrence's background in court compliance mattered here because he understood how narratives get structured. When a report uses broad language like high crime area and suspicious behavior, those aren't facts by themselves. They're labels. Courts and investigators still look for specifics. What exactly did the officers observe? What exactly did they articulate? And what did they do before escalating to force? That's also where the supervisor request came back into focus. Terrence didn't ask for a supervisor as a stunt. He asked because supervisors create accountability in real time. They slow things down. They force officers to explain their basis instead of freelancing. In the footage, his request didn't change the officer's behavior. The escalation still happened fast. In the days after, the video circulated and the conversation widened. Some people took the department's side automatically, treating refusal to identify as the main issue. Others focused on the first principle. Police don't get to order someone off private property without a real reason, then punish them for not playing along. The department tried to keep control by insisting the clip lacked context. That strategy can work when there's no clear record of the beginning. It works less when the beginning is exactly what went viral. By the end of that initial week, Terrence wasn't just dealing with charges. He was dealing with the bigger fight, forcing the city to commit to one timeline, one justification, and one explanation that could survive review. Once Terrence got out and had a chance to breathe, he went straight into the mode he used at work, lock the timeline down, and force everyone to commit to facts. That meant one thing first: getting the records before the story could be cleaned up by repetition. His side started requesting everything that would show what actually happened before the porch contact turned physical: dispatch logs, CAD entries, radio traffic, body camera footage from all 4 officers, and any notes tied to the alleged source information. The department had already leaned on that tip explanation in public. If they were going to hang their whole justification on it, it needed to exist in a form that could be examined, not just described. Terrence also pushed on a narrower question that sounded simple, but controlled the entire case. When did the officers learn about the warrant? A warrant isn't a vague suspicion, it's specific. It has identifiers. It has a time it was checked and confirmed. If the officers knew about it before the first command to step off the porch, the encounter should have started with that basis and the report should reflect it clearly. If they didn't know until after the arrest, then the warrant couldn't explain why they initiated contact or why they escalated that fast. That's where the department's explanation started to feel unstable because it leaned on 2 different justifications that don't always fit together cleanly. One justification sounded like a street stop: high crime area, loitering, refusal to identify, suspicious behavior, nearby vehicle. The other justification sounded like a targeted contact. A source said a man matching his description might be involved in drug activity and could be armed. If it was a targeted contact, the key details should exist somewhere concrete: what was reported, when it was reported, how specific it was, and whether the officers could reasonably connect that information to Terrence, standing on a porch at a residence. If it was a general street stop, the explanation had to answer a different problem: why a man on private property became police business at all. Terrence's approach stayed consistent. He didn't try to win through emotion. He focused on making the department pick one narrative and defend it without hiding behind vague language. Resisting and obstruction charges also looked different once the video kept circulating. Those charges rely on the idea that police were lawfully doing something, and the person unlawfully interfered. The moment the initial contact starts looking unjustified, the foundation for those charges starts getting shaky. That's why his legal strategy centered on the beginning, not the ending. The department, meanwhile, tried to recenter the conversation around cooperation. That's a common institutional reflex. It reframes the issue as behavior instead of authority. It avoids the harder question: did officers have the right to order him off the porch in the first place? Terrence refused that framing. He kept pointing back to the same basic sequence. Officers arrived, issued commands without stating a law, pressed for ID, and escalated into force when he insisted on a supervisor and an explanation. The case turned in a way that happens more often now than departments like to admit. The doorbell camera didn't just create outrage, it created a reference point. Every official statement got compared to those first moments. Every report got measured against what people could see. As the records process moved forward, the pressure started hitting the people above the officers too. Supervisors and city attorneys know that public incidents don't stay at the level of the arresting officers. They become policy questions, training questions, discipline questions, liability questions. Terrence wanted accountability in plain terms. He wanted the charges dealt with fairly. He wanted the officers' conduct reviewed as excessive and unjustified. He wanted consequences that meant something, not a quiet counseling memo and a press line about how the public didn't see the whole thing. By this point, the mask-off moment wasn't a single sentence on the porch. It was the pattern after the fact. How quickly the story expanded once the video made the initial justification hard to defend. By the time the city realized the porch video wasn't going away, the strategy shifted. Early on, the department tried to frame the situation as routine policing in a rough area. That worked for people who always default to the badge. It didn't work for anyone watching the timeline closely. Terrence's side kept pressing for the same things over and over because those are the things that decide outcomes: what the officers claimed, what they wrote, what the dispatch and camera footage showed, and whether the stated reasons for contact matched the moment they chose to escalate. Once that pressure tightened, the case split into two tracks. One track was criminal, resisting arrest, obstruction. Both depended on police being lawfully engaged in the first place. If the initial contact looked unsupported, those charges didn't look strong. That's why the defense stayed centered on the beginning of the encounter, instead of arguing about the exact seconds on the ground. The other track was administrative and civil. That track cared about risk. City risk, department risk, supervisor risk. Video cases don't just threaten an officer's credibility. They threaten the department's ability to defend itself in every future case where that officer testifies. That's expensive. It's also why departments sometimes dig in hard at first, then quietly start looking for an exit. Terrence kept his public position straightforward. He said he was at home. He said the police had no valid reason to approach him the way they did. He said they used force because he wouldn't submit to questions without a legal basis. He demanded consequences. The department kept repeating its justification. Reasonable suspicion, source information, possible weapon, suspicious circumstances, and the neighborhood label. They also kept insisting the public saw only part of the encounter. That line became less useful every time someone replayed the start and asked the obvious question. If there was a lawful basis, why didn't it show up clearly before the physical rush? The warrant discovery stayed in the background like a trap for the department's narrative. If the warrant was known beforehand, it should have been front and center from the first moment. If it wasn't known beforehand, it couldn't justify the initial escalation. Either way, it didn't erase the core question. Did they have a lawful reason to order a man off his own porch and arrest him when he refused? That's where accountability usually comes from in real life. Not from a single dramatic hearing. From the moment a city attorney says the quiet part out loud, this is hard to defend in front of a jury. As the process moved forward, the most common outcome in cases like this is a layered resolution. The criminal charges don't end with a "we were wrong" press conference. They tend to shrink or disappear through court decisions, dismissals, or negotiated outcomes that avoid a trial. That prevents the officers from having to explain the porch decision under oath in a public forum. It also prevents the city from putting the video on repeat in front of a jury. At the same time, internal discipline often happens in a way departments prefer: limited public detail, administrative language, policy reminders, training requirements, and sometimes a more direct consequence for the officer who escalated fastest. The point isn't always to announce punishment. The point is to reduce future liability and show there was action. Terrence's long-term win wasn't just the legal outcome. It was control of the story. The footage made it difficult for the department to turn him into a caricature. He wasn't caught doing something criminal on camera. He was caught standing his ground on private property and demanding a reason. That matters because it changed how people around him responded. Some neighbors who normally stayed quiet spoke up once the video circulated. People who'd had their own late-night encounters recognized the pattern immediately. Vague suspicion, command voice, escalation when the person doesn't play the role expected. Even people who didn't like Terrence's refusal to identify still had to admit one thing: the officers acted like the porch belonged to them. Terrence also had to live with the reality that being right doesn't make the experience light. Getting rushed and arrested at a home leaves a mark. It shifts how you view routine police presence. It shifts how you move at night. It also makes you realize how fast you're free to go can turn into put your hands behind your back when an officer decides the interaction is about dominance. Over time, the case became a local reference point, not because it was the most extreme incident ever recorded, but because it was so ordinary. That's what made it scary. A porch, a cigarette. 4 officers, a command with no clear legal reason, a takedown when the person asks for a supervisor. That kind of video forces a department to clarify what its officers are allowed to do in residential spaces, how they use high crime area language, and what actually counts as reasonable suspicion. It also forces a quiet correction, telling officers that refusal to cooperate isn't the same thing as a crime, and because I said so doesn't survive cameras. Terrence's message stayed consistent through the whole thing. He didn't claim he was above police contact. He claimed he was entitled to the same constitutional limits as anyone else, especially at home. He wanted a system where officers couldn't turn curiosity into detention and then turn detention into charges when the person refused to submit. That's the lesson here. If someone with legal system experience can get treated like this on a porch, anybody can. If a doorbell camera didn't catch it, the report would have been the only version that mattered. If the timeline didn't get challenged, reasonable suspicion would have stayed a vague shield instead of a claim that has to be proven. So let me ask you, if you're on your own porch and police roll up with commands, but no clear reason, what would you do? Would you step off just to make it end? Or would you hold the line